Caleb's small finger was trembling, but his eyes never wavered as he pointed it directly at the man's heart. His voice was a thin, sharp blade in the silence. "Back off, my dad, or I'll make you." The room went ice cold. Cigars stopped glowing. Armed men who had killed for far less froze in disbelief. But the man this 7-year-old was threatening wasn't just some local thug. He was the most clinical, ruthless architect of crime the city had ever seen. And what he did next? It's a moment that still haunts the New York underworld to this day. Make sure you stay until the very end, because the way this boss responds will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if a child stood up to a lion? Now, let's go back. It's a rain-slicked Friday night in 1992 New York. Inside a private wood-paneled cigar lounge, the air is thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and the weight of absolute power. This was Nathan Cole's sanctuary. Outside, 3 layers of the most elite security guarded the perimeter. Inside, the rules were simple. No one speaks unless Nathan asks a question. No one moves unless Nathan gives the nod. At 45, Nathan, the architect Cole, had built a legacy on one principle. Emotion is a terminal illness. He didn't use anger. He used logic. He didn't use revenge. He used logic. He was sitting at his mahogany desk reviewing the week's earnings with the cold precision of a surgeon when the unthinkable happened. The heavy oak doors that required a fingerprint and a guard's clearance, slowly creaked open. There was no hit squad, no rival boss, just a 7-year-old boy in a neat gray button-up shirt stepping into the lion's den with a message that would shatter Nathan's world forever. To understand why the room had fallen into such a suffocating silence, you have to understand the man sitting behind the mahogany desk. In the concrete canyons of New York, Nathan Cole wasn't just some boss, he was a ghost in a $5,000 suit. They called him the architect because he didn't just commit crimes, he engineered them. Every heist, every shipment, and every disappearance was planned with the mathematical certainty of a skyscraper's blueprint. He didn't believe in the messy outbursts of emotion that ruined other men. To Nathan, anger was a leak in the pipes, and sentiment was a crack in the foundation. He sat perfectly still, his slicked-back dark hair catching the dim light of the lounge, his sharp stare fixed on the small boy who had somehow breached his fortress. Behind him, 2 of his top enforcers stood like statues, their hands hovering near the waistbands of their slacks, waiting for the slight nod that would signal the boy's removal. But the nod never came. Nathan was fascinated. For 20 years, Nathan's world had been one of sterile, absolute control. He operated from the shadows of high-end galleries and hushed boardrooms, radiating an aura of danger so thick it felt like physical pressure. People didn't just fear his violence, they feared his mind. He was the man who could dismantle a rival's entire life without ever raising his voice. He lived by a code of cold efficiency, surrounding himself with luxury accessories and loyal soldiers who knew that a single mistake was a permanent one. His life was a series of balanced ledgers and calculated risks. He had spent decades building walls so high that no one, not a police captain, not a federal agent, and certainly not a child, could ever climb them. Yet here was Caleb Foster, standing in the center of the Persian rug, his neat gray shirt a stark contrast to the darkness of the room. The boy didn't look at the guns. He didn't look at the towering guards. He looked straight at Nathan, seeing the man instead of the myth. The architect looked down at his own hands, steady and tan, then back at the boy's pointed finger. For the first time in 15 years, Nathan Cole felt the one thing he had spent his life eliminating, a variable he hadn't accounted for. The sterile air of the lounge suddenly felt heavy with the scent of rain from the streets outside, and as Nathan leaned forward, the gold watch on his wrist glinting, the mask of the cold-blooded boss began to show its very first crack. Nathan leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. He stared at Caleb's outstretched finger, and for a fleeting second, the opulent cigar lounge vanished. The smell of expensive tobacco was replaced by the stinging scent of cheap grease and stale beer. The year was 1962, and Nathan was no longer a king. He was a terrified 10-year-old hiding behind a rusted dumpster in a South Brooklyn alleyway. In that memory, Nathan watched his own father, a man he had once thought was a giant, kneeling in the dirt. His father wasn't fighting back. He wasn't pointing a finger or issuing an ultimatum. He was sobbing, clutching the trouser leg of a low-level debt collector, begging for one more week to pay off a gambling debt that would never truly be settled. Nathan remembered the crushing weight of shame that had settled in his chest that day. He had waited for his father to stand up, to show a spark of fire, to do exactly what this boy was doing now. But his father had stayed on his knees, broken and hollow. That was the day Nathan Cole decided he would never be a victim. He had buried that memory under layers of iron and ice, building an empire so he would never have to beg, and surrounding himself with violence so he would never have to feel small. He had convinced himself that weakness was a choice and that his father had chosen to be a coward. But looking at Caleb, Nathan felt a cold shiver of realization. This boy, with his simple gray shirt and his trembling voice, was doing the one thing Nathan had been too afraid to do 30 years ago. Caleb wasn't a boss, he had no soldiers, and he had no power, yet he was standing his ground against a monster. The bravery radiating from the child didn't just surprise Nathan, it insulted him. It was a living, breathing reminder of the courage Nathan's own father had lacked, and the silence Nathan himself had kept while watching his father's humiliation. Every instinct told him to crush this defiance, to re-establish the order of his sterile world. If a child could stand up to him, then the myth of the architect was a lie. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, Nathan saw a reflection of the hero he had wished for in that Brooklyn alleyway. The boy wasn't just defending a business, he was defending his father's dignity. Nathan's hand, usually as steady as a surgeon's, twitched almost imperceptibly. He realized then that he couldn't just dismiss the boy. He needed to know if this Lionheart was real, or if the world would break Caleb Foster just as it had broken everyone else Nathan had ever known. After the boy was escorted out, not by the scruff of his neck, but with a silent, puzzled nod from the boss, Nathan didn't return to his ledgers. The numbers no longer made sense. He sat in the dim light of the lounge, the ghost of his father still hovering in the corner of the room, until the rain began to lash against the windows with renewed fury. He picked up the phone. He didn't call his usual enforcers. He called a shadow, a man who lived in the city's digital veins and spoke only in facts. "Find the Fosters," Nathan commanded, his voice a low vibration. "Tell me who's leaning on them, and tell me why I haven't heard the name." The report arrived an hour before dawn. As Nathan scrolled through the decrypted files, the cold, clinical walls of his world began to feel like a cage. The Fosters owned a small, struggling hardware store in a neighborhood Nathan supposedly stabilized years ago. They were honest people, the kind of civilians Nathan usually ignored because they were too small to matter. But the ledgers showed a pattern of protection fees that were double the standard rate, brutal, weekly extractions that were designed not to protect, but to bleed a man dry until he had nothing left but his tears. Nathan's eyes narrowed as he traced the money trail. It didn't lead to his central accounts. It curved away, slipping into a series of shell companies and offshore pockets controlled by Marcus the Viper Vane. Marcus was Nathan's underboss, a man he had handpicked for his ruthlessness. But the Viper had grown greedy. He was running a shadow empire within the architect's foundation, using Nathan's name to authorize a reign of petty terror that Nathan had long ago forbidden. Marcus wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing Nathan's reputation. He was turning Nathan into the very bully that had broken his father in that Brooklyn alleyway. The architect prided himself on order and clean business, but Marcus was playing a dirty, desperate game, betting that the boss was too insulated in his luxury high-rise to notice the blood on the sidewalk. A slow, dangerous heat began to rise in Nathan's chest, melting the ice he had lived behind for decades. He looked at the surveillance photo of the Foster's storefront. The windows were boarded up, and the father, a man named Thomas, looked decades older than his actual age. He looked like a man waiting for a blow to land. He closed the file and stood up, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. He had spent years ensuring that no one ever saw him coming, but for Marcus Vane, he was going to make an exception. The Viper thought he was hiding in the tall grass, but he had forgotten one thing. The architect knew every inch of the house he had built, and he knew exactly which beams were rotting. The rain didn't stop. It settled into a persistent, icy drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the city. Nathan sat in the back of a nondescript black sedan, parked half a block away from Foster's Hardware. He had traded his custom-tailored blazer for a dark, heavy overcoat, disappearing into the shadows of the back seat. He was a man who usually viewed the city through tinted glass and security feeds, but tonight he needed to see the friction of the streets with his own eyes. Through the fogged window, he saw them. 3 men, Marcus's collection crew, were standing on the sidewalk, their silhouettes jagged and aggressive. They weren't soldiers, they were scavengers, dressed in cheap leather jackets, laughing as they kicked over a display of outdoor tools. Then the door to the shop creaked open. Thomas Foster stepped out, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a storm. He was trying to negotiate, his hands held out in a gesture of pleading that made Nathan's jaw tighten. It was the exact posture of his father from 30 years ago, the posture of a man who had been stripped of his pride. Suddenly, a small blur of movement disrupted the scene. Caleb darted out from behind his father, his small frame stepping directly between the trembling man and the 3 thugs. He was wearing that same gray shirt, now dampened by the rain. He didn't have a weapon, he didn't have a plan. He simply stood there, his small chest puffed out, holding a plastic toy bat like it was a broadsword. In that moment, the glass between Nathan and the world seemed to shatter. He wasn't looking at a stranger's kid anymore. He was looking at the ghost of the boy he should have been. He saw the fire that he had smothered in himself in favor of cold logic. Caleb was doing what Nathan had never dared to do. He was fighting a giant, not because he thought he could win, but because it was the only honorable thing left to do. The thugs grew tired of the game. One of them raised a heavy hand, ready to strike the boy down. Nathan's hand moved to the door handle, his knuckles white. The architect was gone. In his place was a man who realized that some structures weren't built of steel and stone, but of the raw, unyielding courage of a child who refused to move. The sedan's door opened with a heavy mechanical thud that seemed to swallow the sounds of the street. Nathan stepped out into the rain, his polished boots clicking against the wet pavement. To the thugs on the sidewalk, he was just another shadow in the dark, until the light of a flickering street lamp caught the sharp angles of his face. The laughter died instantly. The man who had been ready to strike Caleb froze, his hand suspended in midair, as if the blood in his veins had turned to lead. They knew that face. Everyone in the underworld knew the face of the man who decided who lived and who vanished. "Leave," Nathan said. It wasn't a shout, it was a low vibrational command that carried the weight of a death sentence. The three men didn't argue. They didn't even look back. They scrambled into their car and tore away, their tires screeching against the asphalt. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Thomas Foster stood paralyzed, his arm wrapped protectively around Caleb's shoulder. He looked at Nathan not with gratitude, but with a fresh, paralyzing terror. He knew he was looking at the apex predator, the man whose name was whispered in the very threats Marcus's men had used. "Inside," Nathan ordered, motioning toward the shop. For a mafia boss of Nathan's stature, entering a civilian's home was a violation of every unspoken rule. It was a breach of the wall between the gods of the city and the people they preyed upon. But as Nathan stepped into the dim, dusty interior of the hardware store, he didn't feel like a god. He felt like an intruder in a sanctuary. The air smelled of sawdust and oil, an honest smell that felt alien to a man who lived in a world of gunpowder and expensive cologne. Thomas stood behind his counter, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the wood to stay upright. Caleb, however, stood tall. The boy's eyes were narrowed, his small jaw set in the same defiant line that had started this entire collision. "I don't want your money," Nathan said, his voice echoing off the rows of tools. "I want the truth. Every cent Marcus Vane took, every threat he made, every time he used my name to make you bleed." Thomas hesitated, his voice a broken whisper. They said you ordered it. They said you liked the extra tax from the weak ones." Nathan's expression didn't change, but inside a structure was collapsing. He looked at the ledgers Thomas fearfully pushed across the counter, pages of desperate math, of a father trying to choose between rent and his son's future. It was a mirror of a past Nathan had tried to bury. He realized then that his silence had been Marcus's greatest weapon. By being a ghost, he had allowed a snake to wear his skin. Nathan closed the ledger, his gaze lingering on Caleb. The line had been crossed, the code was broken, and there was no going back to the sterile safety of his tower. The penthouse boardroom was a cathedral of glass and steel, overlooking a city that Nathan Cole had designed to be his footstool. But as Nathan stepped through the double doors, the air felt different, thick with the static of unspoken treason. At the far end of the long obsidian table sat Marcus the Viper Vane, flanked by four of the family's youngest, most aggressive earners. They were leaning over a map of the shipping docks, their voices hushed, their postures relaxed in a way that suggested they already owned the chairs they sat in. When Nathan entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Nathan didn't jump. He was too smooth for that. Instead, he looked up with a slow, oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nathan, we didn't expect you back from the lounge so early. We were just optimizing the route for the new shipment." Nathan didn't take his seat at the head of the table. He walked the perimeter of the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He looked at the men Marcus had gathered, men who owed their lives to Nathan's blueprints, yet now looked at Marcus for permission to breathe. "Optimizing," Nathan repeated, his voice like the sharpening of a blade. "Is that what you call the extra tax on the hardware stores in the 4th District, Marcus? Optimization?" The smile on Marcus's face flickered and died. He leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his silk tie. "The world is changing, Nathan. The old ways, the clean business, it doesn't pay the overhead anymore. We're expanding the portfolio. I didn't think you'd mind a little extra grease in the gears." "You used my name to terrorize a child." Nathan stopped directly behind Marcus. He placed his hands on the back of the Viper's chair. "You used my reputation to hide a theft from the family." Marcus let out a short, dry laugh, and the men around the table shifted, their hands moving subtly toward their jackets. "The family? "Nathan, you've been sitting in your tower playing chess while we've been in the trenches. The men are tired of your mathematical restraint. They want a leader who isn't afraid to get blood on his hands for a real profit." In the silence that followed, Nathan realized the depth of the rot. This wasn't just a side hustle, it was a coup. Marcus had been using the stolen extortion money to buy the loyalty of the junior lieutenants, building a shadow army right under Nathan's nose. The Viper wasn't just hiding, he was coiled, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nathan looked at the faces around the table, the greed, the hunger, the lack of honor. He thought of Caleb standing in the rain with a plastic bat, and suddenly these monsters looked small to him. "You think you've built a throne, Marcus," Nathan whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from the Viper's ear. "But all you've done is built a tomb, and I'm the only one with the blueprints." The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, turning the streets into a blurred mosaic of gray and black. Marcus Vane didn't believe in loose ends. To him, the hardware store on the corner wasn't just a business anymore. It was the evidence of his treason, a flickering candle that needed to be snuffed out before it set his entire world on fire. He sent his best men to the foster home, not to collect, but to erase. He wanted the message to be loud enough that even a man like Nathan Cole couldn't ignore it. Inside the small apartment above the shop, Thomas Foster huddled with Caleb, the shadows of the hallway lengthening like reaching claws. When the front door splintered under the weight of a sledgehammer, Thomas didn't scream. He simply closed his eyes and pulled his son closer. The thugs stepped into the living room, their faces masked by the darkness, the cold steel of their suppressed pistols glinting in the dim light. They were professionals, moved by cold orders and colder hearts. "Where is he?" the lead thug hissed, stepping toward the trembling father. "He's right here," a voice answered from the shadows of the kitchen. The men spun around, their weapons tracking toward the sound. Nathan Cole stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his overcoat anymore. He stood in his black suit, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the tattoos of his youth, the marks of a man who had fought his way out of the dirt long before he ever sat in a boardroom. He was alone, no guards, no backup, no army. "Nathan?" the lead thug stammered, his aim wavering. "Marcus said you were handled." "Marcus is a mathematician who forgot how to divide," Nathan said, his voice as calm as a graveyard at midnight. He didn't reach for a gun, he simply walked toward them, his presence filling the room until the air felt too thin to breathe. "He thinks power is about how many men you can buy. I'm here to remind you that power is about who stays standing when the money runs out." One of the men, panicked by the sheer audacity of the architect standing before them unprotected, began to squeeze his trigger. In a blur of motion that defied his age, Nathan stepped inside the man's guard, his hand snapping out like a viper strike. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the weapon clattered to the floor. Nathan didn't stop. He moved through the room with a terrifying rhythmic grace, a predator reclaiming his territory. He didn't need an army because he was the storm itself. Within minutes, the intruders were a heap of broken pride on the floor. Nathan stood over them, his breathing steady, his sharp stare fixed on the door. He turned to look at Caleb, who was watching from behind his father's chair. The boy wasn't crying. He was nodding, as if he had known all along that the lion would come. "Stay here," Nathan told them, adjusting his cufflinks. "I have one more foundation to tear down." The ride back to the penthouse was the quietest of Nathan's life. He didn't use the sedan. He walked through the rain, the water washing the blood from his knuckles and the last of the architect's cold indifference from his soul. By the time he reached the lobby of his glass tower, the security guards, men who had been secretly taking Marcus's payroll, saw the look in Nathan's eyes and stepped aside. They didn't see a boss returning to his desk. They saw a ghost who had come back to claim his haunt. The elevator climbed in a hum of tension. When the doors opened to the boardroom, Marcus was still there, pouring a glass of celebratory scotch. He looked up, expecting his hit squad to call in a success. Instead, he saw Nathan, drenched and solitary, holding a stack of leather-bound ledgers he had taken from the Foster's shop. "The hit failed, Marcus," Nathan said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "And so did your math." Marcus reached for the drawer of the obsidian table, but he stopped when he saw the red dots of several laser sights dancing across his chest. From the shadows of the balcony, Nathan's oldest loyalists, the ones who still believed in the old code of honor over the Viper's greed, stepped forward. Nathan hadn't called an army, he had simply called on the men who remembered what it meant to be a lion. "You thought I was too soft because I didn't bleed the neighborhood dry, but I built this city to be a fortress, not a slaughterhouse. You're a termite, and I'm done letting you eat my foundation." With a single nod, the cleaning out happened. It wasn't a massacre, it was a surgical extraction. Marcus and his lieutenants were stripped of their rings, their watches, and their pride before being marched into the night, banished from the city they tried to steal. Nathan watched them go from the window, but his mind wasn't on his empire. He sat at his desk and pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket. On the final page of the Foster family's debt ledger, he didn't write a number, he didn't calculate interest. In bold, sweeping strokes, he wrote 2 words, "Paid in full." Underneath, he added a new directive for his remaining crew. The 4th District was now a no-fire zone. Anyone who so much as looked at a small business owner with a closed fist would answer to the architect personally. Nathan leaned back, looking at his hands. For the first time in 30 years, they didn't feel cold. He had dismantled his own organization to save a hardware store, and in the wreckage of his old life, he felt a strange, terrifyingly human sense of relief. A year had passed since the night the rain tried to wash away the sins of the 4th District. The city was different now. Or perhaps it was just that Nathan Cole saw it through a different lens. The architect still sat in his high-rise, and the ledgers still tracked the movement of millions, but the blueprints of his soul had been entirely redrawn. He no longer ruled through the clinical application of fear. He ruled through a quiet, unbreakable stability that the streets hadn't felt in decades. On a crisp autumn morning, a black sedan pulled to the curb a block away from a prestigious private academy uptown. Nathan sat in the back, the window cracked just enough to let in the scent of turning leaves. He watched as a young boy hopped out of a modest car, his brown hair neatly combed, wearing a blazer that bore the school's crest. It was Caleb. The boy looked taller, his face still innocent, but his stride carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew they were safe. A week earlier, Thomas Foster had received a letter. It was thick, cream-colored stationery with no return address, informing him that an anonymous foundation had granted Caleb a full academic scholarship, covering everything from tuition to a future at any university he chose. Thomas had wept at his kitchen table, but Caleb had simply looked at the letter and then out the window, as if he were looking for a friend he knew was standing in the shadows. Nathan watched through his binoculars as Caleb adjusted his bag and headed toward the school gates. The boy stopped for a moment, turning his head as if he could feel the weight of Nathan's gaze from across the street. Caleb didn't wave, and Nathan didn't move. But there was a silent understanding between the man who had lost his childhood to a bully and the boy who had saved his own with a plastic bat. For 30 years, Nathan had lived in a world of variables and cold calculations, believing that power was a shield against the pain of the past. But as he watched Caleb disappear into the halls of a future Nathan himself could never have imagined, he realized he had been wrong. Real power wasn't the ability to crush, it was the strength to protect. The architect leaned back into the shadows of the leather seat and gave a small, rare nod to his driver. The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flowing traffic of New York. Nathan Cole was still a man of the shadows, and his name was still whispered with respect in the dark corners of the city. But the ghost in the alleyway was finally gone. For the first time in his life, the man who designed the city was finally at peace with his own foundation.